Welcome to Middleweight Politics Political Analysis for the Independent Voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in only red or blue, welcome to your safe space. Because every week, we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington and what we can do to fix it. Now, last week, the resistance movement fought its most formidable opponent in the battle to stymie Trump's agenda, themselves. While all but one House Democrat held the line on voting against a Republican proposal to avoid a government shutdown, their counterparts in the Senate appeared to be just fine with it, with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer coming out to say he would be voting yes. This led to public disagreement between House and Senate Democrats and talk of a primary challenge against Schumer by AOC. But underneath it all lies the question: what exactly is the Democratic counterproposal to the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle the federal government? And might the best approach be to help them? I mean, they're doing it already. We're going to expound on this idea. But first, Shawn, how are you doing?
I will say I'm doing as good as I can be, given the times. I think things are a little bit chaotic, and I found that I can't watch the news for very long these days. So I've started watching March Madness, and I never watched college basketball. So it's been interesting that I watched more basketball yesterday than the last few years. So.
I think that's sound advice. It's funny. I don't even get stressed out by the news anymore. I just get disgusted by it.
Yeah.
Because you can get pro-Trump and anti-Trump in the United States. That's all you can get. Either Donald Trump is marching us into the greatest rejuvenation of this country, or everything's on fire. It is one or the other.
Yeah.
And one could be true, but they're not being honest actors. And I think that kind of tees up the first thing I want to talk about before we get into the main story today, which is a poll put out by CNN last week. Well, last week as of the time of this episode running, this week if we're talking present case with you and I talking. So the headline around the poll said that Democrats' favorability was at an all-time low. That was the headline.
Yeah.
There is some truth to that. So they've had a running poll going with polling firm SRSS, shows Democratic favorability is at 29%. That's the lowest in the poll's history. It's down 10 points from 6 months ago, amazingly, and down from a high of 50% in 2013. Now, what's lost in the headline is the fact that Republicans are polling at 36%. Not their lowest, mind you. Not their lowest, but 36%. And if we look, the Republicans on the whole have hovered at around the 40% mark since 2013.
Yeah.
So first off, that the headline's misleading. But if we look, the only number that's gone up in that poll over the last decade are the number of people who don't like either party. So 13% in 2013, 36% in the most recent poll. So what do we make of this?
The most notable thing that's caused such a gap between the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of favorability are internal support. Republicans, 77% of them, are good with what their party's doing right now. Only somewhere in the 60 percentile of Democrats are okay with what their party is doing. And the notable thing about that is that that's dropped about 20 points since Biden took office in January 2021. But the thing that the listener should know is that when independents were asked, 19% of independents have a favorable view of the Democratic Party, 20% have a favorable view of the Republican Party. So it's not that much difference with independents. They both have a very, very low opinion of both parties.
I mean, like we've talked about many, many times before, independents, the largest voting bloc in the United States, are generally voting against the candidate they feel will do the most damage.
Yeah.
So the ballot they cast for their candidate is actually cast against the other one. And I think what frustrates me most, getting back to the press, is that they are so obsessed with the red versus blue horse race that they've overlooked the fact that most Americans don't like either horse.
Yeah. My advice to voters is stay informed, be educated on what is happening around you. In the case of the media, yeah, it's very reactionary. And so when people need a break, they should take a break from it because in the 24-hour news cycle, they're only going to be covering about 3 stories anyway.
Yeah.
So you only need to watch about an hour of the news to get the gist of what they're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Watch some basketball. Follow Dr. Shawn's prescription. So let's jump ahead then to the main story, which is Schumer and some Senate Democrats allowing the Republicans to pass their continuing resolution to keep the government funded while House Democrats held the line. So to set the stage for you listening, if you're not aware already, which I'm sure you are, House Democrats overwhelmingly opposed a Republican spending bill. They viewed the cuts made to government programs as too severe. And all but one House Democrat voted against that. And many of them were in swing districts. These are people who are very vulnerable to taking votes like this. When the bill got to the Senate, Chuck Schumer and a group of Democratic senators ended up voting in favor, effectively paving the way for this bill to pass. Now, Shawn, it seems like Schumer's mentality is sort of a go along to get along type approach. So he argued that allowing the bill to pass was a strategic move and it would avoid a prolonged government shutdown that could have resulted in even more cuts by the Trump administration. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so Schumer went on The View and talked about this because he was directly confronted with somebody who said that, hey, I'm a Democratic voter and I want you to be fighting more. And Schumer said, we are fighting. We're just fighting smart. And I think the logical reaction to that is, well, you look at what happened with this continuing resolution, and it was really the first test to see if Democrats were going to use the only leverage they have in Congress right now. And while I'm not the biggest fan of filibuster because I think it's done more to obstruct than has to facilitate cooperation between the two parties, it is the only bullet in the Democrats' gun right now. And Schumer decided to take that bullet out because he is of the mindset that, well, as long as we preserve the institutional norms, voters will get behind the order over the chaos, which, as we saw in the last election, is not the case. Voters want people in government that are going to upset the status quo.
Absolutely. I think this has been a mistake on the part of the Democrats since Trump came on the scene, which is the idea that Trump is norm shattering. And if we just defend those norms, we're going to win. Guess what? Norms lost.
Yeah.
Twice, right?
Right. People right now don't trust institutional norms because they've looked at the system and how it's operated for decades and they've seen that it's not working for them. Something within the system needs to change. And I think when you look at the Democratic Party in Congress, there is this divide, clearly House versus the Senate. You had the one U.S. House representative, Jared Golden, vote for the continuing resolution. And I can understand why he did that because he's from Maine's 2nd District, which without ranked choice voting, he would probably lose to a Republican candidate. So I can understand that. But this civil war between the Democrats right now that's happening in Congress is between the old guard that's more center left and more about preserving institutional norms in the Senate. But then in the House, you have the new generation of leadership, the Hakeem Jeffries, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes, that are more progressive left, and they're okay with challenging the norms.
One of my favorite quotes from Schumer after this was, "No one wants to fight more than me." Like, you are doing a great job of hiding that, buddy. Like, give him an Emmy. I think the interesting thing here, though, is in looking beyond the divide within Democrats and just looking at the issue at hand, what we see is that voters are very mixed on their sentiments around the government and around government spending.
Yeah.
So, for example, polling shows us that a majority of voters are uneasy with Musk's efforts to shrink government, feeling it could harm essential services. And they're also upset with the idea of a billionaire in the White House doing the job that was given to Congress by the Constitution. So you would think taking a stand against those cuts would be pretty popular. But then you look at the bigger picture, go beyond Musk, and you see that a majority of voters feel that the government overall is too big or doing too much. So for about 25 years, the majority of voters polled by Gallup have said that the government is doing too much. And right now that's at an all-time high. So 55%, 41% felt it wasn't doing enough. And obviously there's a partisan split there, but independents fall pretty much in line with that poll. Another poll by Pew showed 56% of voters thought government spending is almost always wasteful and inefficient. So I find this interesting because it shows people might actually support cutting the government, but they just don't like Elon Musk.
Well, and they recognize that there's some things that the government does that is essential, that there are these important entitlement programs that the government needs to maintain, and that blanket cuts to federal agencies and the federal workforce without much thought into actually how essential those things are, that's what voters have a problem with. Because government should serve certain functions for the public. After all, we pay tax dollars for it to do certain things. But just to render a lot of these agencies just incapable of working and dismantling them is not the solution that voters want. They're okay with reducing the size of government and reducing the bureaucracy, but they want to be done with a little bit more thought than what it seems to be doing now.
Yeah, I'll take this a step further and say that the majority feels that government spending is wasteful. The majority feels that we should trim federal spending, but they don't want to trim any of the stuff they like, right? And I'm 100% convinced that the things that there are the broadest consensus on in the federal budget are actually probably the worst. And I'll give you one. And I'm going to go on a rant here. Because as far as I know, I'm the only person I know that feels the interstate highway system was a bad idea. And every time they talk about infrastructure spending, it just drives me up a wall. Because I think everybody supports the idea because they're like, oh, I have a car. I drive. I don't like traffic. I don't like potholes. But I'm going to take us all the way back to its foundation. Because this really frames how I feel about the federal government and federal government spending on the whole, which is if you look at the interstate highway system, okay, pitched in 1956 as a defense project, projected cost of $25 billion. That's $280 billion adjusted for inflation. And that it was going to be done in 13 years. So it was 1956. 13 years is 1969, right?
Mm-hmm.
Following me? Okay.
Yes.
The final mile of the interstate highway system was completed in 1991. All right, so 35 years later, cost over $500 billion in today's dollars. Okay? And so you might be hearing this and you might be saying, oh, well, but it improved the economy. It allowed us to travel between places faster. No. So first off, in building the interstate highway system, what they did is they bulldozed through urban neighborhoods and they took lower income jobs out of cities. So what happened is jobs like manufacturing, warehousing, and so on moved out to the periphery of the cities where real estate was cheaper. So if you were a lower income worker in the city, you had two choices, which was either move out or stay there and be unemployed, right? Now, we also have to remember when those highways were built, there were racist housing laws that prohibited all but white people from moving out into the suburbs. So you had a large group of people who were prohibited due to zoning laws from moving to where the jobs were. Mm-hmm. So it's not a big coincidence that after the highways were built, we saw this era of urban blight and we saw all the issues that plagued minority neighborhoods in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Okay? So there's that. Now, It also made us married to our cars. So right now, Americans spend about 16 to 20% of their income on transportation. Germany and France, by comparison, 10 to 13%. US spends $1,000 to $1,200 per person per year on transportation infrastructure. That's double countries like Germany, Japan, and France, right? So it's probably an apt metaphor. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Interstate highway system, well-intentioned project, total disaster. And so in my mind, whenever the government says, hey, this is a good idea, and everybody agrees, run for the hills.
Yeah, I think it was George Carlin that said that if there's bipartisan support for something, that means there's a more nefarious scheme at work. But this speaks to the need for a more nuanced conversation when it comes to government spending. Because, yeah, I think you and I and a lot of people agree that there is a lot of government waste. There's a lot of fat that needs to be trimmed. But when you look at what Doge is doing, getting rid of USAID, which accounts for like 1% of our federal budget, gutting federal workforces, which again, very minuscule percentage of our federal budget. We're not actually looking at where the waste is. We're just saying, hey, we're reducing the size of government by eliminating all these people. And hey, that should be enough, right?
Musk stood on a stage at CPAC with a chainsaw.
Yeah.
That tells you all you need to know. But while you and I were talking about this week's conversation, you brought up to me a really interesting interview with Andrew Yang and Mark Dunkelman, who wrote a book, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back. There's a very interesting take on progressives and on how they've kind of become their own worst enemies. And I don't know if you want to explain this first.
So the whole premise of this conversation is that there's a lot of progressives out there that think that, oh, if we just get 51% in the government, we could enact all the policies that want. What's getting in our way are conservatives. But Mark Dunkelman in his book and in this conversation discusses how really it's progressive policies over the years that have kind of gotten in progressives' own way. So even say when Obama had the White House, had both chambers of Congress, there were programs that he wanted to do that he couldn't because of the bureaucratic infrastructure that has been building for decades, so that at every stage, there could be someone who could just stop that project. So going back to the 50s, we just gotten out of the Great Depression. We just gotten out of World War II. We defeated the Nazis. There is this moment where we were looking to great individuals to solve our issues, right? And we were going to entrust those great individuals to act on big projects at their own behest. But Mark Dunkelman in his book talks about how come the 60s and 70s, progressives started to realize that some of these so-called establishment experts weren't so publicly minded, that some of them wanted to act on their own interest. And some of them wanted to act on behest of big corporations and things like that. So then they wanted to put in mechanisms so that there could be people in place that could say stop when there's a bad project. The problem is over the last few decades, they've overcompensated to the point that anyone could stop even a good project.
Well, it's funny. So I heard an interview with Ezra Klein this week, and he offered a really interesting observation, which is if you look at key progressive issues, such as let's take affordable housing, for example. Well, the bluest parts of the country have done the worst job at that due to restrictive zoning. And I mean, look at it another way. As the Democrats have become the party of the more well-to-do, they've also become the party of people most likely to live in communities with the most restrictive zoning laws out there. Mm-hmm. So fighting things like affordable housing the most. Mm-hmm. And so there is definitely this sense of we need affordable housing, just not in my neighborhood. I'm a lifelong resident of Massachusetts. Cape Wind. There's supposed to be a wind farm project off the Cape. Well, it also happened to be in view of the folks in Hyannis, which is where the Kennedys have their compound. So go figure, never happened.
Yeah.
So I think it's things like that that not only undermine their own initiatives, but also make them look hypocritical in
Right.
the eyes of both independents and the opposition.
So one thing I do find interesting is this sort of paradox that exists in this conversation, right? So the Democrats like to say that the Republican Party is the party that just wants to protect the wealthy at the expense of poor people, right? But when you look at the Democratic Party, as we've discussed in a previous episode, their whole image, right, of what it means to be a Democrat is to be a college educated, at least upper middle class individual, right? They are a party composed of a lot of wealthy people. Whereas when you look at the Republican Party, right, they do have policies that benefit the wealthy, but their voters are rural voters. They're the poor voters. They're the working class. They're the common man.
Yeah.
They're the type of voters that the Democratic Party says they represent.
It's almost like which tobacco company marketed cigarettes the best, and
Yeah.
and the Republicans are just doing a better job. Yeah. So I think that one of the things that I picked up from the Dunkelman interview is the idea that there ought to be a rebalancing of power and that the Democrats could benefit from looking at bureaucratic inefficiencies and prioritizing results over process. So, getting back to something we talked about earlier, instead of being defenders of the norms and instead of being defenders of the status quo, really thinking of themselves as people who want an outcome.
As Dunkelman put in his interview with Andrew Yang, Schumer right now is trying to sell voters a broken refrigerator and saying, hey, trust that it will work when it's clear that it's broken.
As I was thinking through everything we talked about as we were prepping for this, one of the people that came to mind to me was Bill Clinton. Because, of course, Bill Clinton came into the White House, arguably your standard 1980s liberal Democrat. He raised taxes. He tried to implement the first universal healthcare system in the United States. It failed. But once he lost Congress in 94, he pivoted and he really co opted the Republican small government narrative. And I think there is an opportunity for Democrats to do that and to also get back to selling Americans on the idea of what government will do for them. Because I think right now, on one hand, you've got the Trump administration saying government is too large, it's too powerful, we need to cut it. And the Democratic answer is no, it's not. And I don't think voters have quite connected why it's not. I think if they take the mantle of government efficiency through the lens of what government should be doing and why it's not doing it, that could potentially co-opt that position.
If the Democratic Party wants to win in the midterms and in future elections, they have to stop being so reactionary. They have to stop reacting to every little thing Trump does because Trump does a lot. And if they're spending all their time just reacting to Trump, then they're not taking that time for self reflection to think about how their own policies have kind of prevented progress on a number of issues. But also, they're not taking time to work on their sales pitch to voters to tell voters why they are the better option. And I think we saw that in the 2024 elections when Kamala Harris's entire campaign was just a rebuke of Trump instead of focusing on, hey, this is what I'm going to do for voters.
And I think to put it another way, for the last 8 years, the Democratic platform has been "We're not Trump," right? Like that's been it. That's literally been the platform.
Yeah.
And it's not compelling. And I think as uneasy as a lot of people are with Trump's approach and his policies, he's got a platform.
Yeah.
He's selling something.
I mean, it's gotten to a point that even Democrats can't get behind their own party leadership's approach to Trump.
Yeah.
Because all they want to be, all their platform is right now is we're just not Trump, right? Even members of their own party want to see actual leadership. I think one of the most telling things from that CNN poll was when they asked Democratic voters what elected official best represents the core values of the Democratic Party. A third of respondents couldn't name anyone.
I think this gets back to something we talk about a lot, which is that Democratic leadership is primarily comprised of the status quo wing of their party, whereas the Republicans, it's the disruptive wing, right? So Democrats are still largely led by this sort of Obama-Biden coalition of moderates, and the Republicans are led by the nationalists and the Christian right. And I think in an era where the winnable voters are probably the angriest and the winnable voters are the most left out of the conversation, I hate to say it, like radicalism wins.
I think the Democrats have just gotten too comfortable. Schumer knows that he's going to keep his seat. He knows that the prospect of a primary challenge is very slim, but maybe that's what the Democratic Party needs. It needs that motivated grassroots movement to come in and primary some of these Democrats. Republicans are constantly kept on their toes because of threats of being primaried. And I'm not saying that's a good system, but it has made them more responsive to their base. Whereas with the Democrats, they're not even being responsive to their base right now.
Yeah.
Their own voters are going to their town halls and yelling at them, telling them to do something. And their response is, well, we're fighting our best. We're in the minority. There's not really much we can do. But that's not the answer they want to hear.
No, and I think, look, we're going full circle here because this brings us right back to that poll.
Yeah.
And it brings us right back to something we talk about all the time, which is that over the last 50 years, both parties have lost membership. And over the last 12 years, at least as far as this poll is concerned, they've lost support from voters. And fewer voters support either party, right? There are the same number of voters who don't view either party favorably as who view the Republicans favorably. And the Republicans are winning the horse race right now. So I think the real question in all this isn't just how do Democrats pivot to improve their chances, but how do we get the parties to actually be responsive to the concerns of rank and file voters? Shawn, I'm going to cap it there. Thank you very much for listening. If you like what you heard today, Shawn and I have a small request. This is something we say every week, which is Shawn and I are doing this because we feel the two-party duopoly is the problem. And we know there are a lot of people who feel this way. And if we gather in large enough numbers, we can have a real impact. So here's what we need from you. Please share this episode with anyone you think might feel this way too. Be sure to rate this on your podcast platform of choice and write us a review. Those things are going to help us get the word out and help us build the critical mass we need to turn this into real action. Thank you in advance for your support. The music you are hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.